Have you ever felt the powerful call of God on your life, urging you toward a higher purpose? The excitement is real, but before you step into the destiny He's planned for you, there's something crucial you need to know. Before God can fully use you, He must first refine you. And this refinement often comes through tests, divine trials that prepare you for the mission ahead. These 8 tests are not mere coincidences or obstacles to avoid. They are essential parts of God's plan to shape your heart, strengthen your faith, and equip you to carry out His will. Though they may seem difficult or even impossible at times, each test serves a purpose in your spiritual growth and ultimate calling. Are you ready to discover the 8 divine tests that will prepare you for your true purpose? Get ready, because these tests are going to change you in ways you never imagined, leading you straight into the fullness of God's plan for your life. Test number 1. The test of patience. Have you ever felt the pull of something greater, a calling you know deep down is from God, but wondered if you're truly ready? You feel excitement, hope, and even fear all at once, wondering how you'll ever be prepared for what God has in store. Before you can answer His call and step into your divine purpose, you will face what is perhaps the hardest test, the test of patience. Patience is more than just waiting. It's about learning to trust God's timing. The world around us moves quickly. We want instant results, immediate answers, and quick solutions. But God doesn't work on our timetable. His ways are higher, and His timing is perfect. This is where the test begins. We might be waiting for a breakthrough, a revelation, or even just clarity about our next steps. And yet, in that waiting, God is doing something powerful in our lives. In the Bible, patience isn't merely about holding out until the next thing comes. It's about allowing God to mold our hearts, refine our faith, and deepen our trust in Him. And as we wait, we can't just sit idly by. We must continue to serve, to pray, and to remain active in our faith. Just because God hasn't answered our prayers yet doesn't mean we should stop living out our calling. The process of waiting is where the transformation happens. God is preparing us for what He's about to do. The waiting is not the end. It's the preparation. It's in those moments that our faith is stretched, and we are called to trust God in deeper ways. Every delay, every moment of uncertainty, is an opportunity for our trust to grow stronger. When we choose to trust God with our timing, we begin to see that the waiting wasn't wasted. It was necessary. So, as you face the test of patience, remember that God's delays are not denials. Trust that He is at work in the waiting, preparing you for what's to come. Let Him refine your heart, build your perseverance, and strengthen your faith. The best is yet to come, and it will arrive at the perfect moment, in God's perfect timing. Test number 2, the test of faith. Once we've navigated the test of patience, we are faced with another profound challenge, the test of faith. Patience teaches us to wait for God's timing, but faith calls us to believe even when we don't see the way forward. Faith isn't just about holding on to hope in good times. It's about standing firm when the storms rage, when we feel overwhelmed, and when the path ahead seems unclear. Faith is not merely a mental acknowledgement of God's existence. It is a trusting relationship that leads us to act in obedience. Hebrews 11:1 defines faith as confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. In other words, faith requires us to trust in God's promises even when the evidence is absent and the way forward seems impossible. The test of faith comes at the most unexpected times. Just when we think we've figured things out, God leads us into an area where we must rely solely on Him. We see this in the life of Abraham. After waiting for years for the promise of Isaac, Abraham's faith was put to the ultimate test. God commanded him to sacrifice Isaac, the very son that had been promised to him. Genesis 22. It made no sense. It was a test of trust like no other. What did Abraham do? He trusted. He knew that God, who had made the promise, was faithful to fulfill it, no matter how impossible the situation seemed. In that moment, Abraham's faith was more than just a belief. It was an unwavering trust that God would provide, even when the situation didn't make sense. We all face moments when God asks us to step into the unknown, to walk a path that requires us to fully trust Him. Whether it's starting a new venture, stepping out in ministry, or trusting God in a difficult relationship, the test of faith will challenge us to believe when we cannot see the outcome. God's tests of faith are not meant to weaken us, but to strengthen us. Every trial we face presents an opportunity to grow our faith in God. James 1:2-3 encourages us, saying, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." The stronger our faith, the more resilient we become. It's in the testing that we become more like Christ, shaped and refined by His love and power. In the story of the Israelites, as they were led out of Egypt and into the wilderness, they faced many tests of faith. They were led by God's cloud during the day and fire by night. But despite witnessing miraculous acts, they doubted. They questioned God's provision, even after He provided manna from heaven. It wasn't until they were in the desert, with no visible way out, that their faith was truly tested. The question was simple: would they trust God to lead them, even when they couldn't see where they were going? The test of faith isn't just about having big faith in big moments. It's about learning to trust God in the small, everyday things. It's about having faith when you don't know how you will make it through, or when everything around you seems uncertain. It's about choosing to trust in the unseen even when the world around you demands tangible proof. God isn't just asking us to believe in Him. He's inviting us into a deeper relationship, one that requires our trust in every circumstance. Sometimes our faith grows in the quiet moments of daily life, when we choose to believe God's promises even when there's no fanfare. It's those moments that set the foundation for the greater tests of faith that will come. Passing the test of faith requires a few things. First, we must fix our eyes on God's faithfulness, not on our circumstances. Second, we must learn to pray with confidence, trusting that God hears us and will answer according to His perfect will. Third, we need to be willing to act, even when we can't see the entire picture. Faith without action is not faith at all. The test of faith also teaches us to rely on God, not our own strength or understanding. Proverbs 3:5-6 reminds us to trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. It's in our weakest moments that God's strength shines brightest. When we step out in faith, God meets us with His power, guiding us every step of the way. So, as you face the test of faith, remember this: God is not calling you to believe in your own abilities. He's calling you to believe in His. Your faith may be tested, but it will never be in vain. God is faithful to keep His promises, and as you trust Him, you'll see His provision in ways you never imagined. Test number 3, the test of obedience. Once you've faced the tests of patience and faith, the next challenge often feels like a natural progression: the test of obedience. Obedience is the cornerstone of our relationship with God. It's easy to say we trust God, but obedience proves that trust in action. It is one thing to believe in God's promises. It's another to step out and follow His instructions, even when they seem difficult, illogical, or uncomfortable. Obedience to God isn't about a set of rules or a checklist. It's about a surrendered heart. It's saying, "God, I will go wherever you lead me, even if the road ahead is unclear, because I know you are with me." The true test of obedience comes when we are called to act, often in the face of uncertainty, fear, or opposition. Think about Noah. God told him to build an ark, something that must have seemed utterly ridiculous to those around him. At the time, there was no rain, no flood, and no reason for such a massive undertaking. Yet, Noah obeyed. He trusted God, even though he couldn't see the full picture. Genesis 6:22 says, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. His obedience saved not only his family, but the future of humanity. Had Noah allowed his doubts or the opinions of others to hinder his obedience, the outcome would have been drastically different. Moses, too, had to learn the test of obedience. When God called him to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, Moses hesitated. He questioned his own abilities and tried to find reasons why God should choose someone else. But in the end, Moses obeyed, and through his obedience, God performed miracles that brought freedom to an entire nation. Obedience often requires us to leave our comfort zones, to do things we might not understand, and to trust that God knows what's best for us. There are times when the path God calls us to follow won't make sense to others, and sometimes it won't even make sense to us. But the call to obedience is clear: trust and follow, regardless of the challenges. In our own lives, God might ask us to be obedient in ways that stretch us. It might be a call to forgive someone who has wronged us, to step into a new role or ministry, to speak up when we would rather remain silent, or to give sacrificially in a way that feels uncomfortable. The test of obedience is not about doing what is easy. It's about doing what is right, according to God's will, even when it's hard. The Bible makes it clear that obedience is not optional, it is essential. John 14:15 says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." Obedience is not a matter of compliance, it is a matter of love. When we obey God, we are expressing our love for Him, our trust in His plans, and our belief that His ways are better than our own. Jesus Himself demonstrated the ultimate act of obedience when He surrendered to the Father's will, even unto death on the cross. When we pass the test of obedience, we experience a deeper intimacy with God. Our relationship with Him grows stronger, and we begin to see the fruits of our obedience. God rewards our obedience with His favor, and He uses it to bring about His kingdom purposes in our lives. But this reward is not always immediate. Sometimes we must obey for a long time before we see the results. That's why obedience requires patience and faith. It's not just about doing what we're told. It's about trusting that God is using our obedience for something far greater than we can see in the moment. So, how do we pass the test of obedience? First, we must be willing to listen to God's voice, whether it comes through His word, prayer, or the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Second, we need to be willing to step out in faith and do what God asks, even when it doesn't make sense. Third, we need to trust that God's commands are always for our good, even when the path ahead looks difficult. The test of obedience will refine us. It will shape our character and align our will with God's. It will deepen our trust in Him and show us that His ways are always the best ways. But remember, obedience doesn't mean perfection. It means a willing heart, one that says, "I will follow you, Lord, even when the way is unclear. I will trust you, even when the world around me doesn't understand." As you face the test of obedience, know this: God's plan for you is far greater than any sacrifice or challenge you may face. His obedience brought life and freedom to the world. Your obedience can bring transformation to your life, your family, and your community. Trust that He is with you, and that your obedience, no matter how hard, is part of a divine plan that will bring glory to His name. Number 4. The test of surrender. As we continue our journey, having faced the tests of patience, faith, and obedience, we now come to a critical juncture: the test of surrender. This test takes us to the heart of what it truly means to follow Christ. It's one thing to say we trust God's plans and obey His commands, but it's another to completely surrender our will, our dreams, and our future to Him. Surrender is not a moment of weakness. It's a moment of strength, a declaration of trust. It's saying, "God, not my will, but yours be done." Jesus Himself demonstrated the ultimate surrender in the Garden of Gethsemane when He prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Luke 22:42. In that moment, Jesus showed us what true surrender looks like: an absolute trust in God's will, even when it leads to pain and suffering. Surrender isn't a one-time decision. It's a continual process. It's easy to surrender when everything is going well. But what about when life gets tough? What about when God asks you to let go of your own plans, your own desires, or your own security? This is where the test of surrender truly begins. Think about the story of Abraham once again. After waiting for years for the promised son, Isaac, God asked him to surrender the very thing he had longed for: his son. He was asked to lay Isaac on the altar and sacrifice him. How could Abraham, who had waited so long, possibly surrender the child of promise? Yet, in his heart, Abraham knew that God was trustworthy. He knew that God's plans were far greater than his own. Abraham didn't understand why, but he trusted that God's will was perfect, and that was enough. We all face moments when God asks us to surrender something that feels deeply personal. It could be a relationship, a career, a dream, or a place of comfort. The challenge is not just in letting go. It's in trusting that God's plan is better than our own. Surrender requires us to relinquish control and allow God to take the lead, even when we can't see the end result. It's saying, Lord, I trust you with everything, and I know that whatever you ask of me is for my good and for your glory. Surrender is an act of humility. It's acknowledging that we are not in control, and that's a difficult thing for many of us to accept. In a world that teaches us to be self-sufficient, to hold on to our own dreams and desires, surrender goes against everything we are taught. But the truth is, God's ways are higher than our ways, and His plans are better than our plans. When we surrender to Him, we open ourselves up to His incredible purposes. It's in the act of surrender that we experience true freedom. We often think that surrender means giving up our freedom, but the reality is that surrender brings us closer to the abundant life Jesus promised. When we let go of our own desires and trust in God's perfect will, we step into a life of peace and purpose. Jesus said in Matthew 11:28-30, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Rest comes not from holding on to our own plans, but from surrendering them to God. It's when we let go of the need to control every aspect of our lives that we find the true rest that only He can provide. Surrender leads to peace because it allows us to trust God with the things we can't change or control. Surrender doesn't mean that we abandon our dreams, but it does mean that we align them with God's purpose. It's recognizing that God's vision for our lives is far grander than anything we could imagine on our own. When we surrender, we are giving God the opportunity to use us in ways we could never achieve on our own. The dreams He gives us may look different than what we first envisioned, but they will always be far more fulfilling than we could have ever imagined. As you face the test of surrender, ask yourself, what is God asking me to lay down today? What am I holding on to that I need to release to Him? Surrender requires us to trust that God knows what's best, and that His plan will lead us to a place of true joy and fulfillment. It's not always easy. It's not always comfortable. But the test of surrender is essential in the journey of spiritual growth. It's through surrender that we learn to fully depend on God and to experience the life He has destined for us. The sooner we surrender our lives, the sooner we will walk in the fullness of God's perfect will. He's asking us to give up our control, but He's offering us something far greater in return: His presence, His peace, and His purpose for our lives. So, as you move forward in your walk with God, take a moment to reflect on the areas where God is calling you to surrender. Trust Him with your whole heart, knowing that His plan for you is far greater than any dream or desire you could hold on to. Surrender today and experience the freedom that comes with following His perfect will. Test number 5, the test of trust. As we continue through these divine tests, we now encounter one of the most challenging, the test of trust. Trust is the foundation of our relationship with God. While surrender teaches us to let go, trust goes a step further, requiring us to believe that God is good, even when our circumstances are not. Trusting God means believing that He is working all things together for our good, even when the path ahead is uncertain. Trusting God isn't always easy, especially when the storm clouds gather and we find ourselves facing trials that feel overwhelming. It's easy to trust God when everything is going according to plan, but what happens when the plan seems to fall apart? What happens when we face loss, confusion, or fear? This is where the test of trust truly takes root. Think of Job, a man who trusted God through unimaginable suffering. He lost everything: his wealth, his health, his family, and yet he refused to curse God. In Job 13:15 he declares, "Though He slay me, yet will I trust in Him." Job's trust wasn't based on his circumstances. It was based on his confidence in God's goodness, even in the midst of tragedy. He chose to trust God despite the pain, knowing that God's character was unchanging and faithful, regardless of his situation. Similarly, we can look at the Israelites, who were delivered from slavery in Egypt and saw God perform incredible miracles. Yet, time and time again, they struggled to trust Him when faced with difficulties. When they were hungry in the desert, they doubted His provision. When they were trapped by the Red Sea, They questioned his faithfulness. Yet, despite their doubts, God showed his steadfast love and faithfulness by parting the sea and providing manna from heaven. The test of trust forces us to confront our deepest fears: the fear of failure, the fear of loss, the fear of the unknown. It challenges us to ask ourselves, can we still trust God when life doesn't make sense? Can we trust Him when we don't understand why we're facing the trials we are? The answer lies in the nature of God. He is faithful, and He is good. His plans for us are always for our ultimate good, even when the road is rocky. Trusting God also means that we let go of our need to control every situation. It's about choosing to believe that God knows what is best for us, even when His plan doesn't look like our own. Proverbs 3:5-6 reminds us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." Trust requires us to surrender our understanding and rely fully on God's wisdom. One of the most powerful things about the test of trust is that it refines us. Trust grows over time. When we choose to trust God in the small moments of life, it becomes easier to trust Him in the big moments. The more we see God's faithfulness in our everyday lives, the more we are able to trust Him in the difficult seasons. Each test of trust prepares us for the next, building our confidence in His provision, protection, and presence. Consider the example of Peter walking on the water. When Jesus called Peter to come out of the boat and walk toward Him on the water, Peter initially trusted, but when he saw the wind and waves, his trust faltered, and he began to sink. Jesus immediately reached out and caught him, saying, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Matthew 14:31. This moment illustrates how easily we can lose our trust when circumstances overwhelm us. But it also shows that Jesus is always ready to catch us when we begin to sink. Trusting Him doesn't mean we won't face storms. It means that, even in the midst of the storm, He will never let us go. The test of trust is a call to lean into God's promises, to rely on His word, and to stand firm in the assurance that He is always with us. It's easy to trust when we can see the end of the story, but true trust is tested when we are in the middle of the unknown, waiting for God's intervention. This test forces us to hold on to His promises, even when everything around us seems unstable. In the process of trusting God, we learn that He is always faithful, even when we don't see the outcome immediately. Trusting God doesn't mean that life will be without pain or hardship, but it does mean that we are never alone in our struggles. Hebrews 13:5 assures us, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." Trusting God is ultimately about recognizing His presence in every circumstance. As you face the test of trust, remember this: God's timing is always perfect, even when we don't understand it. The waiting, the uncertainty, the trials, they are all part of His refining process. Trust in His perfect plan for your life, even when you can't see the way forward. He is trustworthy, and His promises are sure. Test number 6. The test of loneliness. In our journey toward being used by God, one of the most challenging tests we often face is the test of loneliness. This test can be particularly hard because loneliness isn't just about being physically alone. It's about feeling disconnected, misunderstood, or abandoned, even in the midst of a crowd. It's the kind of loneliness that pierces the heart, making us feel isolated from those around us, and at times, even distant from God. Loneliness can strike at any point in our lives, but it often comes when we are in transition, or when God is calling us to a new level of purpose. It's in these moments of solitude that we can feel as though we are walking alone, with no one to understand or walk beside us. Yet, it's in these very moments that God does some of His deepest work in us. Think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. As He faced the ultimate test of obedience, He asked His disciples to stay and pray with Him. But they fell asleep. Jesus was facing the weight of the world, bearing the sin of humanity, and He felt a deep sense of isolation. Even though He knew His Father was with Him, in that moment, He was alone. And yet, it was in this solitude that He found strength to move forward. He turned to the Father, poured out His heart, and said, "Not my will, but yours be done." Luke 22:42. Jesus' loneliness was a precursor to the ultimate victory that would come through His sacrifice. There's something profound about the test of loneliness. It often forces us to depend solely on God. When we are surrounded by others, it's easy to lean on people for comfort, understanding, and affirmation. But when we face loneliness, we are pushed into a deeper relationship with God. He becomes our refuge, our source of strength, and the one who fills the empty spaces in our hearts. The psalmist David frequently expressed his feelings of loneliness in the Psalms, yet he always found comfort in God's presence. In Psalm 25:16-17 he prays, "Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. The troubles of my heart have multiplied. Free me from my anguish." David recognized that loneliness wasn't just an emotional struggle, it was an opportunity to experience God's nearness in a way that would not have been possible otherwise. God often uses loneliness to draw us closer to Himself. When we are stripped of the distractions and busyness of life, we can hear His voice more clearly. It's in the quiet moments when no one else is around that we can truly sense His presence and experience His peace. Loneliness can be uncomfortable, but it is also a place where God can cultivate a deep intimacy with us, one that can't be forged in the midst of noise or chaos. But loneliness is not just a tool for God to refine us. It's also a test of our character. How we respond to loneliness reveals a lot about where we place our trust and value. It can be easy to fall into despair, self-pity, or bitterness when we feel alone. But God calls us to rise above these emotions and to trust that He is using this time for our growth. Loneliness can either draw us closer to God or push us away from Him. How we respond to it determines the depth of our relationship with Him. Jesus promised that He would never leave us or forsake us. In Matthew 28:20 He said, "And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." Even in our loneliest moments, we are never truly alone. God is with us, and He understands the depths of our pain. The test of loneliness is not about whether or not we feel alone. It's about whether we choose to trust in God's presence and allow Him to work in our hearts during those times. In our modern world, loneliness is often stigmatized, but in the spiritual journey, it can be an important tool for transformation. God never wastes a season of solitude. He uses it to purify our hearts, to teach us how to rely fully on Him, and to mold us into vessels that can be used for His glory. Loneliness is not permanent. It is a season, and like all seasons, it will eventually pass. When you face the test of loneliness, remember that God is near. He sees you in your isolation, and He is working in you during this time. Use this opportunity to draw closer to Him, to seek His presence, and to allow Him to fill you with the peace and strength that only He can provide. As you walk through the loneliness, know that it is not a punishment. It is a process. God is shaping you, preparing you for the purpose He has for you. The season of loneliness is temporary, but the lessons learned in that time will last forever. Embrace it as a gift, a time for deeper intimacy with your Creator, and trust that He will never leave you in your solitude. Test number 7. The test of brokenness. As we approach the final tests on our journey to being used by God, we encounter one of the most powerful and transformational tests, the test of brokenness. This test is unlike any other. It is deeply personal and often painful, yet it is essential in shaping us into vessels that God can truly use. Brokenness is not about being destroyed. It is about being humbled, refined, and transformed into something greater. The test of brokenness often comes when we experience deep loss, disappointment, or failure. It can feel as though we have been shattered beyond repair, that our dreams have been crushed, or that we've fallen short of God's expectations. But it's in these moments of brokenness that God is doing His most significant work in us. He is reshaping us, remolding us, and preparing us for a greater purpose. Consider the story of Joseph. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit. Yet, in the midst of his suffering, God was refining him. Joseph's brokenness was a process that ultimately led to his promotion as ruler over Egypt. His journey of suffering, rejection, and hardship was not wasted. God used it to shape Joseph into the man who would save not only his family, but an entire nation. His brokenness became the key to his destiny. Brokenness is a place where we experience God's love and grace in ways that we can't otherwise comprehend. It is in the broken places of our lives that we are most open to God's healing touch. Psalm 34:18 says, The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. God doesn't abandon us in our brokenness. He draws near to us. He meets us in our pain, our weakness, and our vulnerability, and He offers us His strength and His comfort. The process of brokenness is not one that we would choose for ourselves. None of us desire pain or suffering. But the truth is that God allows us to go through seasons of brokenness to purify our hearts and refine our character. It is in these moments that we learn humility, dependence on God, and the true meaning of grace. Isaiah 61:1-3 speaks to this transformation. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to comfort all who mourn, and provide for those who grieve. God doesn't just leave us broken, He heals us. He doesn't just allow us to experience pain, He uses it to create something beautiful. Brokenness is the soil in which God's promises take root and grow. For many of us, brokenness brings us to the end of ourselves. We can no longer rely on our own strength, our own wisdom, or our own resources. And it is here, in this place of emptiness, that God begins to fill us with His presence and His power. The Apostle Paul knew this well. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, he shares how God spoke to him in his weakness. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." In our brokenness, we come to realize that God's power is most evident when we are at our lowest. When we are broken, God has the ability to rebuild us stronger and more resilient. This is the paradox of the Christian faith. In weakness, we find strength. In brokenness, we find healing. The test of brokenness doesn't just transform us, it also enables us to minister to others. When we have walked through the valley of brokenness and experienced God's healing, we are uniquely positioned to comfort others who are hurting. We can offer the same grace and hope that we have received from God. 2 Corinthians 1:3-4 reminds us of this. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. Our brokenness can become the vehicle through which God pours out His love and compassion to others. It's important to remember that God never wastes a season of pain. He can use even the most difficult and painful experiences for His glory. The test of brokenness is not about defeat, it's about transformation. When we allow God to work in our brokenness, we are made more like Christ, who Himself was broken for us. Jesus experienced the ultimate brokenness on the cross, and through His sacrifice, He brought healing to the world. Our brokenness too can become the place where God's power is displayed, and through it, others can find healing and restoration. As you face the test of brokenness, remember that you are not alone. God is with you, and He is doing a deep work in your heart. Your brokenness is not the end of your story, it is the beginning of something new. God is using this time to prepare you for greater things. Trust Him in the process, knowing that He is faithful to heal, restore, and make you whole again. Test number 8. The test of obedience. We have now arrived at the final test in our divine journey, the test of obedience. This is the ultimate challenge, one that reveals whether we are truly ready to be used by God. It's one thing to endure patience, loneliness, brokenness, or even trust. It's another thing entirely to step out and obey God when He calls us to action, especially when we don't fully understand His plan. Obedience is the final key that unlocks God's purpose for our lives. It's the one thing that shows whether we are willing to follow God completely, even when the road ahead is unclear, or the cost seems too high. We see obedience modeled in the lives of countless biblical figures, but one of the clearest examples is found in the story of Abraham. God called Abraham to leave everything behind, his country, his family, and his comfort, and to go to a land that God would show him. Abraham didn't know where he was going or what he would face, but he obeyed. In Hebrews 11:8 we read, "By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going." This is the essence of obedience, responding to God's call even when we don't have all the answers. Obedience doesn't always come easily. It often requires us to let go of our own desires, plans, and comforts. The call of God is not always convenient or comfortable. Just as Abraham had to leave behind his home and everything he knew, we too may be asked to step out of our comfort zones and trust that God knows what's best. When God calls us to obedience, He isn't just asking us to follow rules. He's inviting us to join Him in His divine work. Obedience is not merely about outward actions. It is about the condition of our hearts. God doesn't want us to obey out of obligation or fear, but out of love and trust. Jesus said in John 14:15, "If you love me, keep my commands." Our obedience flows from a heart of love for God, and it is this love that compels us to obey, even when it's difficult or costly. One of the biggest hurdles to obedience is the fear of what others might think or the fear of failure. But the truth is, when we focus on pleasing God rather than people, we find the courage to obey. In Acts 5:29, Peter and the other apostles said, "We must obey God rather than human beings." The approval of others may feel important in the moment, but when we stand before God, we will only answer to Him. Obedience, then, becomes the pathway to freedom. When we obey God, we align ourselves with His will and step into the fullness of His purpose for our lives. Obedience also has a powerful way of shaping us. When we follow God's commands, we grow in character, integrity, and spiritual maturity. Obedience teaches us humility as we surrender our own will to God's. It refines us, helping us to become more like Christ, who was the ultimate model of obedience. In Philippians 2:8, we are reminded that Jesus became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Jesus' obedience led to the ultimate victory, our salvation. Our obedience, though not as costly as His, leads us to greater freedom and joy in the Lord. Another aspect of obedience is trusting God's timing. We may be called to obey in a season that feels like a waiting game, and in those moments it's easy to question whether God is really in control. But God's timing is always perfect. Just as God called Abraham when the time was right, He calls us to obey in His perfect timing as well. Often, the obedience we give in these moments of waiting and trusting prepares us for what lies ahead. When we step into obedience, we may not see the immediate results. Sometimes we obey in faith, trusting that God will reveal the fruits of our obedience in due time. There may be seasons where it feels like we are stepping out into the unknown, not seeing the full picture. But just as a farmer plants seeds without knowing exactly when the harvest will come, our obedience plants seeds in the kingdom of God that will one day bear fruit. The beauty of obedience is that it aligns us with God's will and allows us to be a part of His grand story. It's a partnership with God, where He equips us, empowers us, and uses us for His glory. Each step of obedience is like a building block, creating a foundation for the next chapter of His purpose in our lives. As you face the test of obedience, ask yourself, are you willing to follow God, even when it's hard? Are you ready to step into His calling for your life, no matter where it may lead? Remember that obedience is not about perfection. It's about trusting God and taking the next step, even when you don't have all the answers. It's about saying yes to God, regardless of the cost. Obedience is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of something new. As you obey God, you open the door to His greater purposes. You position yourself to be used by Him in ways you never thought possible. And in the process, you become more like Christ, who was obedient to the point of death. God is calling you to step into the fullness of His plan, to trust Him fully, and to say yes to His will. As we reflect on the 8 divine tests we've explored, patience, trust, loneliness, brokenness, obedience, and the others, we realize that each test is not a roadblock, but a stepping stone. These tests are God's way of refining us, shaping us, and preparing us for the incredible purposes He has for our lives. No test is wasted. Each one plays a vital role in our spiritual growth, molding us into the vessels God can use to impact the world. Remember, the journey may not be easy, but it is worth it. God is with you every step of the way. And when you emerge from these tests, you will be stronger, more resilient, and more ready to step into the fullness of your calling. Trust Him through the process. Lean into His grace. Embrace the tests. For in the end, God will use you in ways you never imagined. If this journey of divine tests has resonated with you, I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. How have these tests shaped your relationship with God? Which test has challenged you the most, and what did you learn from it? If you feel led to, like and share this video with someone who needs encouragement through their own journey. Let's support each other in walking through these tests with faith, hope, and obedience. God is with us, and together, we can fulfill His purpose for our lives.